thanks for the sludge a bit. Okay, this talk, I'd like to start by saying thank you to the ARC, saying thank you to the COE. Work that has produced this talk is by a lot of collaborators, and I'll try and acknowledge those as I go. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to talk a bit about work that we've done experimentally and models to show some new lines of evidence as to how climate change variables, mainly ocean acidification and to some extent warming, are affecting physiological processes. And here I'm going to be quite coral-centric. Then we'll try and use some of those results to talk about effects on communities, processes, and start addressing questions about how that might influence reef resilience. Lastly, I'd like to address the question, at least, about how we can address local, maybe we can find local solutions to a global threat, or whether that is in fact possible. Others in this room have done a very good job about introducing ocean acidification, so I'm not going to do that. Malcolm's done that, Janice has done that, Phil has done that very well. All I'm going to say is that this is a chemical consequence of rising atmospheric CO2 concentrations, which is quite different from that of warming. The work on ocean acidification in terms of reef-building organisms, in particular corals, has been quite calcificentric. It's been mainly about how pH is changing, how CO2 is changing, and how that is driving the change in carbonate ions. As we've seen earlier, most of the work that's been done mainly on the corals has been looking really at how that affects calcification, and there's a lot of evidence to show, and I wouldn't say suggest, actually indicate quite strongly that reefs will decline in terms of calcification rate. What we know much less about really is how other physiological, biological processes are being affected by ocean acidification and also warming together, and that's really what I'd like to focus on here. I'd like to start with some results we published last year. This was a large multi-author paper on the effects of ocean acidification, mainly on bleaching, and we demonstrated really for the first time that bleaching itself, or CO2 itself, or ocean acidification, leads to bleaching risk. Right? So we saw Acropora, we saw coralline algae, and to some extent Prurites, bleaching simply by the effect of the chemical, the consequence of the chemistry. Now, what this graph shows here is on the y-axis, bleaching as a visual measure, and the x-axis is 3 different treatments or 3 different groups of pHs representing today's pH, or CO2, which is sort of around the 380 mark, and then we had a mid-century and a late-century treatment using sort of an A1 FI, a high fossil aggressive scenario really as our experimental base, and really the effects of the CO2 treatment after 2 months was quite strong. Right. So here, this is not a calcification response, it's actually a response in the physiology. Other people in the group are looking at what the consequences, what the mechanisms might be. But what we did was try and look at those results and ask the question, what could the consequences of this be really for the predictions of future bleaching risk? And what we did was do a modeling exercise, and there's a lot of people in this paper, so this et al. Is probably 15 co-authors, of which a lot of them are from the COE here. What we showed using this simulation was that acidification may in fact double coral bleaching risk. So acidification itself might actually elevate the risk that coral might bleach simply due to the chemical effect. What we did here was use 2 scenarios from the IPCC, the A1FI scenario, and we ran the model for effects of SST, which means our current understanding of how corals bleach in response to warming, and then the added CO2 effect from our experiments. And what we demonstrated here by comparing, say, this red area, which is the CO2 and thermal, with that just for predictions for the SST, where there was almost a doubling in the bleaching risk. For the B1, which is a more conservative scenario, it was the same pattern. So clearly a physiological effect of acidification. Now, something that interests me a little bit more, in fact, from this when we start thinking about what this means for communities is really interactions between species. And one of the interactions that we care probably the most about is the interaction between algae and corals. I think the authorities on reef resilience, and I think most of them actually in this room, and I think that they have demonstrated, shown quite clearly that resilience, or the dynamics of corals and macroalgae to a large extent drive reef resilience. What we know little about, though, is how physiological drivers such as effects of CO2 and temperature on corals and algae might actually be driving resilience patterns sort of from the bottom up. I'm going to start by showing you the results of a very recent study that's been done under supervision of Guillermo Diaz-Pulido and Sophie and myself. And what this graph shows is really captured very well by the title. Climate change turns algae into coral killers. If you look at the red line here, that's the survival curve for coral algal pairs. This is Acropora with a bit of Lobophora thallus stuck to it, right? So we had a large experimental design where we had these pairs in different treatments, and the one in the high CO2 treatment, the 1,000 parts per million, the corals in that treatment died within 3 weeks. If you compare that to the other treatment, especially the pre-industrial treatment, which was 280, it took much longer for the corals to die. What's really interesting is if you compare that to the coral controls, which were corals without algae, but also corals with mechanical controls, really sort of wrappings of creative wrappings of latex around the bases. We sort of demonstrated that there is a biological effect here. The algae are killing corals much faster when they're under high CO2. We don't really know what the mechanism is, but we're working on it. Now, if we start sort of adding those bits and pieces into the bigger questions about resilience, then we might actually really be surprised about what the effects downstream are. Now, the first graph I'm going to show you is one in a series of 6, and this first one requires a little bit of explanation. What this shows is the percent coral cover on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the time axis into this century. The colors here show the frequency. So red is higher than 80% and blue is down to about 0%. So what this shows is really a distribution. This is based on a Monte Carlo analysis of a model we've built derived from Peter Mumby's coral community model, but where I've put a climate change axis, a combined CO2 and warming axis on the community model, where we've fit in parameters from experimental stuff and from a bit of a meter analysis. So what, in essence, this graph shows is a frequency distribution or a probability of coral cover as we are walking out through this century. And this is for the B1 scenario, so this is the green end of the IPCC scenarios. And we've run this first simulation for high grazing. So this is no overfishing, so this is a good part of the GVR. So high grazing, lots of herbivores, a green scenario, and we're running the model out through the century. What the pattern shows is that as we are early in the century, there is a gravitation towards coral, right? So this all looks good. As we are moving out in the future, there's a gradual decline in coral cover, but corals are still the domain of attraction. As we continue, as we drop the amount of grazing on the reef, the pattern changes so that as we go to about mid-century, there is a dual state. There's a regime where we can either have corals or algae. So this is an alternate state regime, so that a lowered resilience really as a metric. And as we go to very low grazing, we end up having dual states. These are not stable states actually. There's a model run without stable states. So, but as we continue out with climate change, we will end up with algae or turfs being the point of gravitation, Now this is the other scenario, the other end of the extreme. This is a fossil fuel aggressive scenario. And what this shows is almost the same as the B1 scenario, except, and this is the important point, that you can drive the system from coral abundance, high coral dominance, to algal or turf dominance, even under high grazing. So this first column here takes a take-home message that climate change itself can shift us from high resilience to low resilience. And of course, if we at the same time also have overfishing, then things go even faster. So climate change and overfishing hand in hand will definitely push reefs to the bad end of the scale. So by way of conclusions, I think it's probably not too bold to say, based on the evidence, that reefs cannot be resilient to climate change if we consider it to be a one-way road. It is a continuous downward trend of conditions that will prevent reefs from springing back. You can't spring back if you don't have the conditions that allow you to exist. Local actions to increase resilience, probably not a solution for climate change problems, even on well-managed reefs like GBR, which means we shouldn't be complacent about climate change. If we can't fix climate change, then overfishing and other things is going to be less of a problem. It's the Titanic versus the deck chair analogy. Overfished reefs will be more vulnerable to climate change, so that makes us perhaps think a bit about other countries that are less fortunate in terms of not having well-managed reefs, such as reefs maybe in the Coral Triangle. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.